She sat in a chair for months while needles burned away her hairline, one follicle at a time, reshaping her face to erase her Spanish heritage. And Hollywood demanded it. 15 of your most beloved stars endured transformations you can't imagine. Physical pain, identity theft at age 5, decades living under names that felt like prisons. What you're about to discover will change how you watch every classic film. Norma Jean Mortensen to Marilyn Monroe. Norma Jean Mortensen never had a chance at a normal childhood. Born in 1926 to a mother who would soon be institutionalized for mental illness, she spent her formative years shuttled between 11 different foster homes and orphanages across Los Angeles. The little girl, who would become the world's most recognizable face, endured assault in at least one of those homes, developed a stutter when nervous that would surface under stress for her entire life, and married at 16 primarily to avoid returning to the orphanage. When she signed with 20th Century Fox in 1946, studio executives delivered their verdict immediately. Norma Jean was too plain, too forgettable, too ordinary for Hollywood stardom. The transformation was carefully orchestrated. Her new surname would come from her mother's maiden name, Gladys Pearl Monroe. It was a connection to the woman who had abandoned her, a ghost she carried throughout her life. For the first name, they chose Marilyn, inspired by 1920s Broadway star Marilyn Miller. Years later, she would explain that she picked it because it sounded like a movie star should sound. Glamorous, aspirational, completely divorced from the frightened child in foster care who had stuttered through her words. Marilyn Monroe became the most famous woman in the world. Her platinum blonde hair, breathy voice, and curves made her an international icon. Millions adored her. Magazine covers proclaimed her perfection. Yet according to those closest to her, Norma Jean, the scared foster child, never left. Biographers report that in her quietest, loneliest moments, particularly late at night in her bedroom, she would whisper her real name to herself, trying to remember who she had been before Hollywood manufactured the goddess. She kept a worn photograph from her childhood, labeled Norma Jean in faded pencil, hidden in a jewelry box. She would take it out late at night and stare at the little girl's face, searching for recognition, searching for the child she'd been before the transformation. She once told a friend that everyone loved Marilyn Monroe, but nobody knew Norma Jean. Marilyn gets the flowers and the attention, she reportedly said. Norma Jean gets nothing. She's still that scared little girl, and nobody wants to meet her. The split between these two identities created a loneliness that fame could never fill. On August 5, 1962, she was found deceased at age 36 from an overdose of barbiturates. The woman who had brought joy to millions had never been able to heal the wounded child within herself. Her choice of Monroe as a surname, her mother's maiden name, revealed everything. She had reached back to the woman who couldn't raise her, trying to forge a connection that would never fully heal. Marilyn's name change was an attempt to escape pain, but our next star's transformation required actual physical agony that most people couldn't imagine enduring for fame. Margarita Carmen Cancino to Rita Hayworth. Margarita Carmen Cancino was everything her father could have wanted. A talented dancer who could match his steps, carry on his legacy, and light up any stage. Born in 1918 in Brooklyn to Spanish dancer Eduardo Cancino, young Margarita grew up immersed in the world of dance. Her father trained her from childhood, teaching her the intricate footwork of Spanish flamenco, the passionate arm movements, the fierce pride of their cultural tradition. Her dark hair fell naturally around her face, framing features that reflected her Spanish ancestry proudly. She spoke Spanish fluently, celebrated her family's traditions, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was. But when Columbia Pictures executives saw her in the mid-1930s, they didn't see star potential. They saw a problem that needed fixing. Her low hairline, they declared, made her look too ethnic. Her dark coloring would confine her to playing exotic secondary characters. In 1930s Hollywood, Latina identity meant she'd never be a leading lady. The solution Columbia devised was both systematic and cruel. They would erase Margarita Carmen Cancino entirely and rebuild her as someone America could embrace. The transformation began with her hair. Columbia dyed it auburn permanently, washing away the natural dark color she'd inherited from her father. She sat in the salon chair for hours while chemicals burned her scalp, watching in the mirror as her Spanish coloring disappeared. But that wasn't enough. Her hairline sat too low on her forehead, a feature they associated with her Spanish background. The studio sent her for electrolysis treatments, a process that involved inserting a needle into each individual hair follicle and burning it out with electric current. Week after week, month after month, she endured the excruciating sessions. Each treatment raised her hairline slightly, inch by painful inch, reshaping her face to look less Latin and more Anglo-Saxon. The pain was so intense that she would leave sessions with her forehead red, swollen, and throbbing. She would go home and press cold compresses to her forehead, tears streaming down her face, while her father watched in helpless silence. Eduardo Cancino, the proud Spanish dancer who had taught her to be proud of their heritage, watched his daughter's features that resembled his own, being systematically altered to erase their shared ancestry. He would hold her hand during the worst moments of pain, but there was nothing he could do to stop it. The studio owned her contract, and the transformation was mandatory. Then came the name. Margarita Carmen Cancino disappeared from all studio records. In her place appeared Rita Hayworth, a name that sounded Irish, acceptable, completely American. The studio fabricated a background that downplayed her Spanish roots and emphasized a fictional Irish ancestry. Publicity materials were rewritten. Interviewers were instructed never to ask about Spain. By 1937, the transformation was complete. Rita Hayworth became the all-American dream girl. Her image graced the lockers of millions of servicemen during World War II. She starred in Gilda in 1946, delivering a performance so sultry and confident that audiences were mesmerized. But she famously lamented years later, "They went to bed with Gilda and woke up with me." She never reconciled the woman she was with, the fantasy Columbia had created through months of physical pain and ethnic erasure. When her father passed away, she reportedly wept not just for his loss, but for the loss of the only person who had known her as Margarita, who had called her by her real name, who remembered the proud Spanish girl before Hollywood erased her. Rita's transformation required physical pain, but our next star's name concealed something even more shocking about his private identity, a secret so dangerous that his agent engineered an entire masculine persona specifically to hide it. Roy Harold Scherer Jr. to Rock Hudson. Roy Harold Scherer Jr. was working as a telephone operator in Los Angeles when he caught the eye of talent agent Henry Wilson in 1948. The young Navy veteran was impossibly handsome, tall, broad-shouldered, with classic masculine features that made people stop and stare. Wilson knew immediately that Roy could be a star. But he also knew something about Roy. Something carefully guarded. Something that would need protection if Roy was ever going to succeed in Hollywood. Henry Wilson specialized in creating male stars during the 1940s and 50s. But he didn't just find talent. He manufactured entire identities. Wilson had a particular method for certain actors he discovered. He gave them hypermasculine names specifically designed to project strength, power, and unquestionable masculinity. Tab Hunter, Troy Donahue, Race Gentry. Each name was carefully engineered, each syllable chosen for maximum masculine impact. And for Roy Scherer, he crafted something even more powerful. Wilson combined rock from the Rock of Gibraltar, immovable, strong, eternal, with Hudson from the Hudson River. Powerful, all-American, impossible to question. Rock Hudson. The name itself was engineered masculinity, designed to project heterosexual strength in every syllable. When Wilson first said the name aloud to Roy, testing how it sounded, he saw something flicker across the young man's face. Recognition that this name would be both protection and prison. Universal Studios loved it immediately. They signed him to a contract in 1948, and the creation of Rock Hudson began in earnest. But behind this hypermasculine name lay something Wilson knew had to remain hidden. Roy Harold Scherer Jr. was hiding something. Something that could end his career instantly, land him in prison, or worse. In 1950s Hollywood, there were secrets you could manage and secrets that could destroy you completely. Roy's secret was the latter. Every time someone said Rock Hudson, they reinforced a carefully constructed fiction. Every magazine interview where he discussed dating beautiful actresses, every romantic scene with a gorgeous co-star, every publicity photo showing him as the epitome of masculine strength. All of it was designed to protect what Roy was really hiding. The name became a cage, bars constructed from syllables that promised one thing while concealing another. And his agent, Henry Wilson, knew that if reality ever came out, the name Rock Hudson would be the only thing that might save him from complete destruction. The reality was this: Roy Harold Scherer Jr. was a gay man living in an era when his orientation could end his career, land him in prison, or worse. The ultra-masculine name wasn't just marketing, it was armor. A shield designed by an agent who understood exactly what he was protecting. The irony was devastating. The more famous Rock Hudson became, the more completely Roy Scherer disappeared, and the harder it became to live authentically even in private moments. The name that was supposed to free him to work became the thing that trapped him most completely. In 1955, when rumors about Roy's private life began circulating in Hollywood, Wilson arranged a solution: marriage. Rock Hudson married Phyllis Gates, his agent's secretary, in a ceremony designed purely to stop the whispers. The wedding photos showed Rock Hudson smiling broadly, looking every inch the happy bridegroom. But those who knew him reported that Roy felt like he was attending his own funeral, watching the last possibility of living authentically disappear behind wedding vows that meant nothing. The marriage lasted 3 years before Gates filed for divorce. Hudson resumed his carefully hidden private life, maintaining the Rock Hudson persona publicly while living authentically only in the most guarded privacy. The name designed to project strength became a cage he lived in for 37 years. Friends later said he would sometimes drink alone late at night and mutter, "My name is Roy Scherer," as if reminding himself that he existed beneath the construction. When he was diagnosed with AIDS in 1984, he initially kept it secret, still protecting the identity that name represented. Only in 1985, when his illness became impossible to hide, did the reality finally emerge. He passed away on October 2nd, 1985, becoming the first major celebrity to put a human face on the AIDS crisis. But by then, Roy Harold Scherer Jr. had been buried for so long that even in obituaries, he was remembered almost exclusively as Rock Hudson, the name that had imprisoned him, protected him, and ultimately defined him in ways that erased who he really was. Rock's name imprisoned him in a manufactured identity, but some stars' transformations came from survival in an industry that demanded conformity at every level. Lucille Fay Lesueur to Joan Crawford. Lucille Fay Lesueur had worked as a dancer before arriving in Hollywood, doing whatever was necessary to survive. When MGM studio chief Louis B. Mayer signed her in 1925, he saw potential in the young woman's talent and determination. But he also saw a name that had to disappear. Lesueur, he declared, was completely unacceptable. Cruel classmates throughout Lucille's childhood had mocked the name, claiming it sounded like sewer. Mayer wanted nothing common, nothing mockable about his rising star. Rather than simply assigning her a new name, MGM took an unusual approach. They held a fan magazine contest in 1925 called Name the Star. The studio invited thousands of readers to submit their ideas for what this promising young actress should be called. The winning submission came from a woman who suggested Joan Crawford, sophisticated, elegant, completely divorced from Lucille's working-class past. When Lucille heard the name, she reportedly despised it. She told friends it sounded like crawfish, harsh, awkward, nothing like the glamorous identity she'd imagined for herself. But MGM had made their decision, and Lucille Fay Lesueur had no choice in the matter. The studio began using Joan Crawford in all her publicity, on every contract, in every film credit. Slowly, Lucille began to disappear. But something unexpected happened. As Joan Crawford became famous, disciplined, driven, the epitome of Hollywood professionalism, Lucille began to embrace the manufactured identity. She grew into it so completely that she legally changed her name and refused to ever be called Lucille again, even by family members. Friends who slipped and used her birth name were corrected sharply. The woman erased herself to become the star MGM had manufactured through a fan magazine contest. Yet this total embrace of Joan Crawford came at a cost that few understood. Lucille's family back home watched their daughter transform into someone they barely recognized. Her sister later recalled that Lucille had been warm and vulnerable, while Joan Crawford was controlled and distant. When her brother visited her on set in the 1930s, he tried to call her Lucy, the childhood nickname she'd loved. She looked at him coldly and said, "That person doesn't exist anymore." Her own family became strangers because they knew Lucille, and Lucille was someone Joan Crawford refused to acknowledge. Joan Crawford became one of Hollywood's most enduring icons, working from the silent era through the 1970s. But Lucille Fay-Lesur, the working-class girl who had survived through determination and grit, who had been warm enough to have a nickname like Lucy, was buried so completely that she effectively ceased to exist. The name chosen by a stranger through a contest became more real to her than the one her parents had given her. And the cost was a family who grieved for a sister and daughter they'd lost to Hollywood's manufactured perfection. Joan chose to completely erase Lucille, but our next star spent his entire career trying to become the person Hollywood invented and never quite succeeded. Archibald Alexander Leach to Cary Grant. Archie Leach grew up poor in Bristol, England, in circumstances that would haunt him throughout his life. When he was young, his mother was institutionalized. He was told she had passed away. The boy who would become one of Hollywood's most sophisticated leading men grew up in poverty, speaking with a working-class Bristol accent, desperate to escape the life that had been handed to him. At 16, he joined a traveling acrobat troupe as a stilt walker, eventually making his way to America with dreams of reinventing himself completely. When Paramount Pictures signed him in 1931, executives delivered immediate feedback. Archie Leach sounded like a plumber, not a movie star. His working-class British accent and common name contradicted everything Paramount wanted to sell. Refined elegance, sophisticated charm, the epitome of masculine grace. They offered him an unusual solution: lists of first names and lists of last names, all pre-approved by the studio. He could mix and match to create his new identity. Archie chose almost randomly from the combinations presented to him. Cary Grant. It sounded sophisticated, American, completely divorced from the poor Bristol boy who had arrived with an acrobat troupe. Paramount loved it immediately. The transformation of Archie Leach into Cary Grant began. For decades, Cary Grant became the definition of sophisticated masculinity. His accent, carefully trained to remove every trace of Bristol, became iconic. His timing, his charm, his effortless elegance made him one of Hollywood's most beloved stars. He appeared to be exactly what his name suggested: refined, confident, completely at ease in his own skin. But beneath the glossy image lay far more complexity. Grant later famously said, "I pretended to be somebody I wanted to be until finally I became that person, or he became me." The uncertainty in that statement made everything clear. Even he wasn't sure where Archie ended and Cary began. In the 1950s, he underwent LSD therapy sessions, legal at the time and used for psychological exploration, specifically trying to reconcile Archie Leach with Cary Grant. He told his therapist about the profound disconnect between the person he'd been and the persona he'd created. Even after decades of stardom, he confessed he never fully succeeded in integrating his two identities. Those close to him reported that Grant struggled with the split throughout his life. The working-class Bristol boy who'd been told his mother was gone, who later discovered she was alive and had been institutionalized, never fully merged with the sophisticated leading man Paramount had created. When he learned his mother was alive, decades after being told she had passed, the revelation shattered something in him. It confirmed that lies could be maintained for lifetimes. If his mother's existence could be hidden, was his own identity any more real? Archie Leach remained buried somewhere inside Cary Grant, a ghost that no amount of fame or success could lay to rest. Cary spent decades in therapy, trying to reconcile his split identity. But our next star's name change came from ethnic prejudice that declared certain backgrounds completely incompatible with stardom. Isur Danielovich to Kirk Douglas. Isur Danielovich grew up in crushing poverty in Amsterdam, New York, the son of Russian Jewish immigrants who had fled persecution in their homeland. His father, Herschel Danielovich, worked as an illiterate ragman, collecting scraps to sell while his family struggled to survive. Young Isur, his name meant prince in Hebrew, knew hunger intimately. He would later recall fighting other children for food, wearing clothes so threadbare they barely kept out the winter cold, living in conditions that Hollywood's future audiences could never have imagined for one of their leading men. His father told him stories about the name Isur, about what it meant to be a prince, even when the world treated you like nothing. Herschel would take his son aside during their hardest days and say, "In Hebrew, you are royalty. Never forget." He would repeat it like a prayer, like a promise that their circumstances didn't define their worth. Young Isur carried that contradiction, prince in name, pauper in reality, throughout his difficult childhood. The name became both a burden and a source of pride, a reminder of who his father believed he could be, even when the world saw only poverty. At home, they spoke Yiddish, mixed with broken English. His mother would call him Izzy, with such tenderness, such hope for his future. Family dinners, when there was enough food, were filled with stories of the old country, of traditions they fought to maintain in their new American life. The name Isur connected him to all of it, to ancestors he'd never meet, to a heritage that ran deeper than poverty could touch. When he enlisted in the Navy during World War II, someone suggested he should consider anglicizing his name. Isur Danielovich, they explained, would never work in Hollywood. To casting directors in the 1940s, it meant one thing: unemployable as a romantic lead. Jewish identity during that era meant character roles only: gangsters, merchants, ethnic sidekicks. Never the hero, never the leading man. The doors he wanted to walk through would remain closed with a name like Isur Danielovich on the contract. Someone suggested Kirk Douglas. It sounded strong, Scottish, completely non-Jewish. When he returned from service and began pursuing acting seriously, he used the new name exclusively. Studios loved it. Kirk Douglas got auditions that Isur Danielovich never would have. He walked into casting offices and saw the difference immediately. Doors opened, scripts were offered, possibilities materialized that had been invisible before. Back home in New York, his family still called him Izzy. His mother would hold his face in her hands and whisper his real name like a blessing. He lived split between two identities for years: Izzy to his family, Kirk to the industry that was making him a star. At family gatherings, he would feel the weight of it, the way his father would look at him with pride and something else. A sadness, perhaps, for the name that was being left behind. Kirk Douglas became one of Hollywood's most powerful actors. His intensity, his passion, his commanding presence made him unforgettable in films like Champion in 1949 and Lust for Life in 1956. The fierce determination audiences saw on screen wasn't acting. It was Isur, the boy who had fought for everything, channeled through the persona of Kirk Douglas. But the name that launched his career was the same name that buried his true identity. The irony became apparent decades later. Douglas eventually became one of Hollywood's most outspoken advocates for Jewish causes and identity. In 1960, he produced Spartacus, hiring blacklisted screenwriter Dalton Trumbo and crediting him openly, a move that helped break the Hollywood blacklist. He embraced his Jewish background publicly, spoke about it in interviews, and became a voice for representation. In his later years, he would end interviews by proudly stating his birth name, reclaiming what he'd been forced to hide. But he only felt safe doing this after becoming a star as Kirk Douglas. The name that hid his identity gave him the platform to eventually celebrate it, but only after years of concealment had secured his place in Hollywood. The boy whose Hebrew name meant prince had traded his true identity for a Scottish-sounding invention. And while he eventually reclaimed his roots publicly, Isur Danielovich remained buried in the foundation of Kirk Douglas's success. His father's words, "In Hebrew, you are royalty," stayed with him, a reminder of the prince he'd been forced to hide to become the star the world would celebrate. Kirk eventually reclaimed his roots publicly, but our next star transformed himself so completely that even his distinctive accent disappeared, erased through months of intensive training. Bernard Schwartz to Tony Curtis. Bernard Schwartz grew up in a tough Bronx neighborhood in New York City, the son of Hungarian Jewish immigrants who had come to America seeking opportunity. His father worked as a tailor, the family lived in poverty, and young Bernie spoke with the unmistakable thick accent of the Bronx. But he was extraordinarily handsome, matinee idol looks that caught attention wherever he went. When Universal Studios scouts saw him in the late 1940s, they knew he could be a star, but not as Bernie Schwartz. Universal Studios changed everything systematically. Bernard became Tony, Italian-sounding, more palatable than obviously Jewish to 1950s audiences. For the surname, they took his mother's maiden name, Kurtz, and modified it slightly to Curtis. Tony Curtis sounded safe, acceptable, marketable. But the name was only the beginning of the transformation. Bernie's Bronx accent was unmistakable. Every word marked him as working class, ethnic, completely wrong for the romantic leads Universal envisioned. The studio enrolled him in months of grueling speech training. Day after day, coaches worked to eliminate every trace of the Bronx from his voice. They taught him to flatten his vowels, soften his consonants, speak in the smooth, unaccented tones that Hollywood demanded. He would practice for hours, repeating phrases until his natural speech patterns disappeared. Bernie Schwartz was being erased one syllable at a time. Tony Curtis became a major star, appearing in films like Some Like It Hot in 1959, alongside Marilyn Monroe and Jack Lemmon. His charm, his looks, and his carefully trained voice made him one of Hollywood's most popular leading men. But he later admitted he always felt like an imposter. The smooth-talking movie star was a construction, and Bernie Schwartz was still there underneath, never quite forgotten. Those close to Curtis recalled a particularly poignant moment, showing the cost of his transformation. When his mother visited him on a film set one day, she called out to him in Yiddish-inflected English, "Bernard, Bernard, Shana Poonim." My beautiful face. The crew members turned, confused. Who was Bernard? Curtis reportedly looked pained, caught between two identities. His mother still saw her son Bernie from the Bronx. Hollywood saw only Tony Curtis. He walked over to his mother quickly, quietly asked her in English to call him Tony on set, and the hurt in her eyes stayed with him for years. He later expressed that the accent training had made him feel like he was erasing Bernie Schwartz one syllable at a time, and he wasn't entirely sure the trade had been worth it. Tony felt he'd erased his former self to succeed. But our next star's name change demonstrated how Italian ancestry was considered an outright career obstacle in mid-century Hollywood. Anna Maria Luisa Italiano, to Anne Bancroft, Anna Maria Luisa Italiano was a Bronx-born Italian-American actress with serious dramatic training at the prestigious Actors Studio in New York. She had talent, determination, and genuine skill honed through years of study under Lee Strasberg. When 20th Century Fox signed her in 1952, executives saw all of that potential. But they also delivered a blunt assessment. Italian names meant gangster moles and domestic servants. Never sophisticated leading ladies, never serious dramatic actresses. Fox didn't suggest the change, they demanded it. The studio gave Anna Maria a list of acceptable Anglo-Saxon and Irish surnames to choose from, pre-approved options that sounded respectable to 1950s audiences. She had to pick one. Looking through the options, she chose Bancroft almost randomly from a telephone book because she liked how the letters looked on the page. The visual aesthetics of the name mattered more than any connection to her identity or history. Anne replaced Anna Maria as more elegant and less ethnic. Anne Bancroft went on to become one of Hollywood's most respected actresses. She won the Academy Award for The Miracle Worker in 1962, earned a Tony Award for the stage version, and became known for sophisticated, complex performances that showcased her actor's studio training. Her talent had always been there, but it took an Anglo-Saxon name for the industry to recognize it. But she later reflected on what the name change had cost her. Losing Italiano meant losing her visible connection to her family and cultural identity. According to friends, her parents never fully understood why Anna wasn't good enough for Hollywood. They had raised their daughter with pride in their Italian background, taught her to value her ancestry. They spoke Italian at home, cooked traditional meals, and maintained connections to their cultural roots. Having her reject the family name, even for professional reasons, created a wound that never fully healed. Her mother would cry when watching her daughter's films, whispering "Anna Maria" at the screen, mourning the visible connection to their family that had been erased. The arbitrary nature of the change, picking a name from a telephone book because the letters looked nice, only emphasized how little her real identity mattered to the industry. What mattered was erasing the ethnic marker that would have confined her to stereotypical roles. And Bancroft achieved everything Anna Maria Italiano could have, but only after burying the name that connected her to her family and her roots. Anne's family felt the loss personally. Her parents' pain made clear an uncomfortable reality. In Golden Age Hollywood, even love couldn't protect your identity. Studios had the power to erase not just your name, but your family's pride in who you were. And if you think ethnic erasure was the worst Hollywood demanded, what's coming next will show you something even more painful. Because some stars didn't just hide their backgrounds. They spent decades living with choices that haunted them, carrying regret that never fully healed. Subscribe now, because these next stories cut even deeper into the cost of manufactured identity. Virginia Catherine McMath to Ginger Rogers. Virginia Catherine McMath was born in 1911 in Independence, Missouri, to a family that valued education and independence. Her mother, Layla, was a determined woman who worked as a screenwriter and journalist, rare for women of that era. Young Virginia grew up watching her mother fight for every opportunity in a male-dominated world, learning that success required both talent and strategic navigation of systems designed to exclude you. But when Virginia began performing in vaudeville as a teenager, theater managers took one look at her name and balked. Virginia McMath looked plain on a marquee, they said. Too long, too ordinary. Nothing about it suggested the spark and energy this young dancer possessed. It didn't sell tickets. The transformation happened almost by accident. Virginia had married young dancer Jack Pepper, a brief marriage that would end quickly. But the experience gave her mother an idea. Her mother's maiden name was Rogers, which sounded sharp and memorable. For the first name, they used a childhood nickname. Virginia's young cousin had struggled to pronounce Virginia and called her Ginger instead. The family had found it endearing, charming in the way childhood mispronunciations often are. Layla saw it as marketable. Ginger Rogers was born from a toddler's mispronunciation and a mother's maiden name. Virginia McMath, the serious, educated young woman who read voraciously and wrote poetry in journals she kept hidden, disappeared into this brighter, bubblier creation. And unlike some stars who resented their manufactured names, Ginger embraced hers completely. She became Ginger Rogers so thoroughly that even her mother started calling her Ginger at home. But here's what audiences never understood. Ginger Rogers the performer was sharp, witty, could match Fred Astaire step for step and make it look effortless. Virginia McMath had been all those things too. The talent wasn't manufactured, only the name was. Yet for the rest of her life, she would hear people say things like, "You don't seem like a Ginger," when they met her off screen. They expected someone frivolous based on the name. What they got was Virginia, smart, serious, politically engaged. The woman who had written poetry as a girl and would later fight for her artistic choices in ways that shocked studio executives who thought Ginger suggested someone more compliant, someone easier to control. She once told an interviewer that she loved the name Ginger Rogers because it had given her stardom. But sometimes, late at night when the performances ended and the crowds went home, she missed being Virginia. She missed the name her father had chosen with care, the name that suggested depth instead of sparkle, the name that would have let her be taken seriously from the start instead of having to prove there was substance beneath the Ginger snap brightness with every role. Ginger Rogers danced backwards in heels and made it look easy. But Virginia McMath had dreams beyond dancing, dreams of directing, of being taken seriously as an artist, of being seen as more than Fred Astaire's partner. The name that made her famous may have also been the name that limited how the world saw her, the created assumptions she spent decades fighting. And that realization haunted her more than she ever publicly admitted. Ginger kept her manufactured name and found both success and limitation within it. But our next star's transformation erased her entire regional identity, declaring that Texas roots were incompatible with ballet sophistication. Tula Ellis Finclea to Cyd Charisse. Tula Ellis Finclea was born in Amarillo, Texas, in 1922. She was an extraordinarily talented ballet dancer from childhood, training intensively and developing remarkable skills. Her family sacrificed to pay for lessons, drove her to classes, supported her dreams. When MGM signed her for their elaborate musical productions in the 1940s, they recognized her talent immediately. but they also delivered their verdict on her name. Tula Finclea from Amarillo was too country, too unsophisticated, too fundamentally wrong for the European ballet elegance MGM wanted to sell. The solution came from her first marriage. At age 16, Tula married Cyd Charisse, a European whose surname sounded French and sophisticated. MGM executives loved it instantly. Charisse suggested Paris, ballet, refined European culture. For her first name, they experimented. Maria was tried first, then Lily. Finally, the choreographer's nickname stuck. Cyd, shortened from Sydney, a childhood name that sounded unique and memorable. Cyd Charisse was born. Tula Finclea disappeared from every studio record, every publicity photo, every film credit. The Texas girl who had trained so hard was replaced by someone who seemed to have emerged fully formed from European ballet tradition. Publicity materials suggested she had trained in Paris, implied a sophistication that had nothing to do with her Amarillo upbringing. But here's the remarkable twist showing how completely she embraced, or was absorbed by, her manufactured identity. When Tula divorced Cyd Charisse in 1947, ending their marriage, she made an unusual decision. She legally kept his surname permanently. Most women returned to their maiden names after divorce or took their next husband's name. Not Tula. Even after marrying singer Tony Martin in 1948, a marriage that would last 60 years until her passing, she remained Cyd Charisse professionally and legally. Tula Finclea had disappeared so completely that even her own family reportedly began calling her Cyd. Consider that choice. She kept her ex-husband's surname through 6 decades of a second marriage. The name mattered more than the individual who had given it to her. What mattered was maintaining the sophisticated European identity MGM had constructed. Cyd Charisse was more real to her than Tula Finclea had ever been. Or perhaps Tula had been buried so deeply that recovering her was no longer possible. Cyd kept her manufactured identity even through a second marriage. But our next star's transformation came with a resentment that lasted his entire career, and a family cost that few understood. Spangler Arlington Brahe to Robert Taylor Spangler. Arlington Brahe had one of Hollywood's most distinctive names. Unusual, memorable, impossible to forget. Born in 1911 in Philly, Nebraska, he arrived in Hollywood as a young individual with movie star looks. He was so extraordinarily handsome that women reportedly fainted during his early screen tests at MGM. The studio recognized his potential immediately, but Louis B. Mayer, MGM's powerful studio chief, took one look at his name on the contract and declared it impossible for a leading man. Mayer's publicity team went to work, inventing Robert Taylor to replace the distinctive Spangler Arlington Brahe. The new name was deliberately simple, masculine, completely generic. It could have belonged to anyone, which was precisely the point. Spangler objected strenuously. His family name had history and meaning. But Mayer's response was blunt. Accept the new name or the contract would be terminated. Spangler capitulated, but what MGM and the public never understood was the deeper wound this caused. Spangler Arlington Brahe wasn't just a distinctive name. It was his grandfather's name, the man who had helped raise him after his own father struggled. His grandfather had been his hero, teaching young Spangler everything about honor, integrity, and family pride. The old man would take young Spangler fishing and tell him stories about the Brahe family history, about the meaning behind their unusual name, about the importance of carrying it forward with dignity and making the family proud. When Mayer forced him to abandon it, Spangler felt like he was betraying everything his grandfather had taught him. The shame was visceral, physical, like a constant weight in his chest. He would lie awake at night, imagining his grandfather's disappointment. Years later, in letters to his family that surfaced after his passing, he wrote about the pain of seeing his grandfather's name disappear from marquees, replaced by something he called manufactured and meaningless. He wrote about attending his grandfather's funeral and feeling like he'd already erased the old man's legacy, like he'd failed the one individual who had believed in him unconditionally. He reportedly told a journalist, "They took away my name and gave me something that sounds like a tax attorney." But the family cost extended far beyond his personal shame. His mother stopped attending his premieres after the name change. She couldn't bear it. Friends later said she would sit in darkened movie theaters alone, watching her son on screen, and quietly whisper "Spangler" every time his character's name was called. She told relatives that hearing thousands of people cheer for Robert Taylor felt like watching her son be claimed by strangers. At family gatherings, relatives struggled painfully with what to call him. Using Spangler felt like denying his success, like holding him back. But using Robert felt like accepting the erasure of their family identity, like agreeing that Spangler Arlington Bros wasn't good enough. His younger sister later recalled how the name change created an invisible wall between her brother and the family. "We lost Spangler," she said in an interview decades later, her voice still breaking with emotion. Robert Taylor was successful, famous, wealthy. But Spangler, the brother who taught me to ride a bike, who looked like Grandpa, who carried that name with such pride, he was gone. We grieved him like a loss, like a person who had passed away, even though he was still physically present. Robert Taylor became a major star in the 1930s and 40s, appearing in films like Waterloo Bridge and Quo Vadis. But the resentment never faded. Spangler Arlington Brew was buried underneath that generic invention, carrying with him his grandfather's legacy, his mother's silent grief, and his own unshakable sense that he'd betrayed the people who had loved him first. The man born with one of Hollywood's most distinctive names ended his career with one of its most forgettable, and that loss haunted him until his final days. Robert resented his generic name and carried his family's loss. But our next star was completely recreated by a Svengali director who controlled every detail of her transformation. Betty Joan Persky to Lauren Bacall. Betty Joan Persky was modeling in New York when she was 19 years old, appearing on magazine covers and building a modest career. In 1943, director Howard Hawks' wife Nancy spotted Betty's face on the cover of Harper's Bazaar. Hawks was preparing to make To Have and Have Not, a film that would star Humphrey Bogart. He wanted an unknown actress to play opposite Bogart, someone he could mold completely, someone with no established persona who would accept his total control. Betty Joan Persky from the Bronx, daughter of Romanian Jewish immigrants, seemed perfect for transformation. She was young, beautiful, and had no film experience to create resistance to his methods. Hawks controlled every detail of Betty's recreation. Her first name changed from Betty to Lauren, more mysterious, more sophisticated. For her surname, he used her mother's maiden name. Her mother's family name had been Bacall, Romanian in origin. But Hawks added an extra letter, making it Bacall, more elegant, less obviously ethnic to 1940s audiences. But the name was only the beginning. Hawks taught her to lower her voice, creating the sultry, distinctive tone that would become her trademark. He controlled how she moved, how she looked at the camera, even how she delivered specific lines in their scenes together. He famously instructed her to hold her chin down and look up when the camera rolled, a technique that made her eyes appear larger and more seductive. Every gesture, every glance was choreographed. He chose her wardrobe, directed how she wore her hair, controlled how she stood and walked. Lauren Bacall later said Hawks created me completely. Her voice, her look, her name, even her personality were his inventions. It wasn't mentorship, it was manufacture. When she married Humphrey Bogart in 1945, friends noted something telling. Bogart called her baby and slim, never Betty, never Lauren. She had become someone neither name fit, a woman who existed somewhere between the girl she'd been and the icon Hawks had manufactured. Even the person closest to her couldn't call her by either of her names because neither name represented who she actually was. She had become something else entirely. Hawks' creation, more than her own person. The Svengali-like control Hawks exercised showed the extreme degree to which studios and directors believed they owned not just their stars' public images, but their entire identities. Betty Joan Persky ceased to exist. Lauren Bacall was created, and the woman caught between those two names spent her life performing the role Hawks had written for her, never quite sure where the performance ended and her authentic self began. Lauren became someone Hawks created, but our next star's name change tried to erase wartime prejudice that made German ancestry dangerous in 1930s America. Lauren Bacall once said, "Howard Hawks created me completely." Do you think stars like her lost themselves in these manufactured identities, or did they find freedom in becoming someone new? And which of these 15 buried names deserves to be remembered most? Natasha, Margarita, Isur, or Marion? Tell us in the comments. And what Golden Age topics should we uncover next? The secret affairs studios covered up, the stars who vanished mysteriously, or the contracts that gave studios complete control? Let us know below. Doris Marianne Kappelhoff to Doris Day. Doris Marianne Kappelhoff was a talented young singer in Cincinnati, Ohio in the late 1930s, performing with local bands and building a following. In 1939, bandleader Barney Rapp gave her harsh but honest feedback. Her German surname would never fit on a theater marquee. More significantly, with war tensions rising in Europe and anti-German sentiment growing in America, German names weren't exactly helping careers. Kappelhoff needed to disappear. Rapp made the decision for her. He renamed her after her signature performance song, Day After Day, but shortened it to simply Day. Doris objected immediately. She thought it sounded too short, too simple, almost incomplete. One syllable felt inadequate, insubstantial. But Rapp insisted the simplicity was exactly the point. The day was memorable, distinctly American, and impossible to mispronounce or mock. Most importantly, it carried no trace of German ancestry. By 1939, when Doris began performing professionally, the timing of her name change became even more significant. Within 2 years, America would enter World War II. German surnames became liabilities, markers of potential disloyalty in the eyes of suspicious neighbors and audiences. Performers with German names found themselves unemployed, suspected. Doris Kappelhoff would have struggled to build a career during wartime. Doris Day faced no such barriers. She eventually embraced the name and became synonymous with wholesome American optimism throughout the 1950s and 60s. Her sunny persona, her girl-next-door appeal, and her seemingly effortless charm made her one of Hollywood's most bankable stars. But decades later, she expressed something telling about the split between her public and private selves. She reflected that she was always Doris Kappelhoff inside. Doris Day was someone she played, a character she performed even when cameras weren't rolling. That distinction mattered. Doris Day was an invention, a wartime necessity that became a lifelong role. Doris Kappelhoff, the German-American girl from Cincinnati, remained buried underneath, known only to herself and those closest to her. The performance never quite ended, because the name that replaced hers required constant maintenance of the persona it represented. Doris performed her wholesome persona for decades, but our next star lost her identity before she could even choose it herself, stolen from her in childhood by a mother desperate to escape prejudice. Natasha Nikolaevna Zakharenko to Natalie Wood. Natasha Nikolaevna Zakharenko was born in San Francisco in 1938 to Russian immigrant parents who had fled their homeland seeking opportunity in America. Her mother Maria and father Nicholas brought their culture, their language, and their dreams with them. Young Natasha grew up speaking Russian at home, surrounded by her family's traditions, eating traditional foods, hearing old country songs, learning Russian fairy tales. But Maria Zakharenko watched the political climate in America carefully. By the late 1940s, as Cold War paranoia swept the nation, she recognized a terrible truth. Her daughter's Russian name could destroy any chance of success in Hollywood. When Natasha was cast in her first film at age 5, Happy Land, released in 1943, director Irving Pickle made a suggestion that Maria seized upon immediately: make the little girl's name more American. Maria didn't hesitate. She understood survival, understood that sometimes protection required erasure. At 5 years old, Natasha Nikolaevna Zakharenko ceased to exist. Natalie sounded sophisticated and completely American, with no hint of foreign origin, nothing that suggested communist connections or un-American loyalties. For the surname, they borrowed from director Sam Wood, who had helped cast the child. Natalie Wood was created. Natasha was buried. Consider what that meant. Unlike stars who made conscious choices as adults to change their names for career survival, Natasha had no say in her own erasure. She was 5 years old. She didn't choose to become Natalie Wood. She didn't decide to hide her Russian background. She had no voice in the most fundamental question of identity, what she would be called. Her mother made that decision for her, and by the time Natasha was old enough to understand what had been taken from her, it was too late. Natalie Wood was already who she was to the world. Contracts bore that name. Credits listed it. Millions knew her as Natalie. She grew up as Natalie, became one of Hollywood's most beloved stars. She appeared in Miracle on 34th Street as a child. Then, as a young woman, delivered unforgettable performances in Rebel Without a Cause in 1955, West Side Story in 1961, and Splendor in the Grass in 1961. Her talent was undeniable, but her Russian background was so completely buried that she spoke almost no Russian and rarely discussed her immigrant roots publicly. The little girl named Natasha had been erased so thoroughly that she never got the chance to know herself, never got to explore what it meant to be Natasha Nikolaevna Zakharenko, never got to decide as an adult whether she wanted to reconnect with those roots. When she tragically drowned at age 43 in 1981 under mysterious circumstances that remain disputed to this day. The tragedy that captivated the nation unfolded around a name that wasn't hers. The world mourned Natalie Wood. The questions, the mystery, the speculation all centered on Hollywood's star. But it was Natasha Nikolaevna Zakharenko who drowned that night off Catalina Island. The 5-year-old Russian girl whose mother had erased her identity never got to grow up and reclaim her name. The woman born Natasha Nikolaevna Zakharenko was mourned worldwide as Natalie Wood. Obituaries mentioned her Russian birth name as a footnote, if at all. But who mourned Natasha? Who remembered the little girl from San Francisco who spoke Russian at home, who sang Russian lullabies with her mother, who ate traditional foods and heard old country stories, who never got to choose whether she wanted to be Natasha or Natalie? That choice was made for her at 5, and she carried it to the water that night, mourned under a name she never chose, remembered as someone she never decided to become. The tragedy of Natalie Wood extends beyond her untimely ending. It's the tragedy of a child who lost her identity before she was old enough to understand what that meant, mourned under a name that had been forced upon her when she was too young to object, remembered by a world that never knew Natasha existed. Natalie never got to choose her own identity. And we close with the star whose feminine birth name became Hollywood's greatest irony, the ultimate symbol of masculinity built on a foundation most would find impossible to believe. Marion Robert Morrison to John Wayne. Marion Robert Morrison was a soft-spoken college boy attending the University of Southern California on a football scholarship in the late 1920s. He worked as a prop man on Hollywood sets to earn extra money, moving equipment, and learning the industry from the ground up. In 1930, director Raoul Walsh spotted something in the young individual, a natural presence, physical capability, an undefinable quality that suggested star potential. But Fox studio executives immediately identified a fatal flaw: his first name. Marion was too feminine for a Western hero. In the 1920s and 30s, Marion was predominantly a girl's name. Audiences would never accept a cowboy hero named Marion. They'd laugh at the incongruity, unable to take seriously a gunslinger introduced as Marion. The executives could picture it, audiences chuckling in theaters, unable to accept Marion as tough or dangerous. Additionally, Morrison sounded too Irish for the all-American cowboy archetype Fox envisioned. The studios wanted someone who could embody American frontier masculinity, and Marion Morrison wouldn't work. Walsh suggested Anthony Wayne, after Revolutionary War General Mad Anthony Wayne, a figure associated with toughness, military prowess, and American history. Fox studio head Winfield Sheehan modified it, changing Anthony to John Wayne. The name was simple, strong, impossible to feminize or mock. It sounded exactly like the hero of Western films should sound: direct, masculine, American, uncomplicated. The transformation was so complete that Marion Morrison effectively ceased to exist. Throughout his decades-long career, Wayne refused to answer to his birth name, even from family members. If someone called him Marion, he would ignore them or correct them sharply, sometimes angrily. The boy named Marion became the Duke, Hollywood's ultimate definition of American masculinity, the embodiment of toughness, frontier spirit, and traditional male values. The irony was absolutely perfect. The individual who became America's symbol of masculine strength, who represented everything traditional American manhood supposedly meant, started with the most feminine name in Hollywood. John Wayne, the Duke, the cowboy hero, the war film icon, was built entirely on the buried foundation of Marion Morrison. Every time he projected strength on screen, every time he embodied masculine ideals in westerns and war films, He was performing a role that began with erasing the feminine name he'd been given at birth. Consider the layers of that construction. Wayne spent his entire career embodying a specific version of masculinity. Traditional, tough, uncompromising, the strong, silent type who solved problems with his fists. But that entire persona was created specifically to overcome the problem of his feminine birth name. The masculinity itself was manufactured, designed to be the opposite of Marion, to bury that name so deeply that no one would ever connect John Wayne with a girl's name. And audiences believed it completely. For decades, John Wayne was American masculinity personified. Marion Morrison was forgotten so thoroughly that even mentioning it seemed impossible. Seemed like a joke someone was making up to mock the cowboy icon. The next time you watch these legends on screen, look closely. Really look. When Marilyn Monroe smiles in Some Like It Hot, you're watching Norma Jean perform, the foster child still searching for love through a goddess's manufactured smile. When Rita Hayworth dances in Gilda, you're seeing Margarita move, but hearing a name that isn't hers, watching a face reshaped through months of electric needles burning away her Spanish features. When John Wayne rides across Monument Valley, Marion Morrison is buried under every hoofbeat, under every tough guy line, under every masculine gesture designed to erase the feminine name he was born with. These weren't just actors playing roles. They were people playing themselves, or rather, playing the people Hollywood demanded they become. Imagine that weight. Imagine answering to a name that isn't yours for 30 years, 40 years, your entire life. Imagine your own mother unable to call you by your real name in public, forced to whisper it alone in dark theaters, mourning the child she raised while watching a stranger perform under a manufactured name. Imagine drowning under an identity you never chose, mourned by millions who never knew your real name. Imagine your family grieving for the person you used to be while you're still alive, transformed into someone they barely recognize, someone who refuses to even acknowledge that the old you ever existed. They gave us everything. Their talent, their beauty, their vulnerability on screen. But Hollywood demanded more. It demanded their names, their heritage, their family's pride, their very selves. If these buried identities have stunned you, give this video a thumbs up and share it with fellow classic film lovers who think they know everything about Golden Age Hollywood. We remember the stars. Tonight, we've honored the people they had to stop being. This is Golden Age Files, where the names in lights were often the first lies told. Thank you for watching.